So we've covered models, views and collections, and the final base object that Backbone provides for us is routers. So we're going to take a look at that now. A router is a nice way to keep track of state in your application. It essentially translates the path in your URL at the time, or in a hash, in the hash of the URL, depending on what you're using. It translates that path into application state. So it'll match the path to a function, and then your function can start instantiating whatever views, models, collections you need. So far we've looked at models, views and collections, but we haven't really looked at how your models, views and collections get instantiated in the first place, and where would be a good place to do that. And routers kind of deal with that problem for you by matching up a URL to a function that will actually do the instantiation. So if we take a look inside my router that I have set up for this application, you can see it has an initialize function just like views and in fact collections and models. And then it has this interesting routes object. And what routes is, I suppose it's somewhat similar to the events object that you can pass to a view. It matches URL routes to callback functions. So for example, what I'm saying here is that if the URL matches images / anything, then call the image callback. And that's down here. So the first interesting thing is this matching parameter. If you put colon something, then that gets passed into your function as the first argument. So that's handy because it means that immediately when I visit my /images /image ID, I can get that image ID straight into the function. And then I can go and find the correct model out of my images collection, and if it doesn't exist, then I instantiate a new one and fetch it. And then I can instantiate a new top level view to represent that image and already pass in the correct model. And really that's pretty much all that routers do, is match your URLs and then instantiate the right objects to render whatever you want to render on that page. The last route in your routes hash should just be empty, and that will represent your index, which I have down here. So my app knows to do something when it hits the index page. And I suppose if you just have a look, I can show you that function getting called when you hit that route. So we've got our router class set up, but we need to instantiate that as well. And that would tend to be the top level first script that you run. Don't worry about the require.js stuff that I've got going on here. We'll cover that in a separate chapter. So all that I do in my top level code is just instantiate the router. And once I've done that, I've got my router instance, which is set up ready to listen to events. But it's not quite, because you need to actually bind to changes on the URL. And you do that by calling backbone.history.start. And you notice I'm passing in a push state true argument there. And what that does is tell the browser to actually use proper URLs if it can. I could also not pass that in, and then suddenly this won't do anything. But if I use a hash, then it will work in just the same way. And actually, this experience with the hash is what you would get if you were using an older browser that didn't support HTML5 history. So we've got our application set up to render the correct views when the URL changes. But what we haven't done yet is set up internal links to follow through to the correct router path. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let me just refresh the page here. If I do a new search, what I get back is this list of images. And if I hover over one, it's a link to images/image ID. So all I've got here is a standard link that points to a URL that can be handled by my router. But I haven't actually got an event listener on that link to prevent the browser from just following it blindly and doing a full page refresh. So what I like to do is in my, where I boot up the router, where I instantiate the router, is to also just set up a jQuery event listener on the body. And what this does is looks for clicks on any anchor element where the href starts with a /. So that would be essentially any anchor, if we just check this out, where the href looks like this, so there's no domain in front of it. Set that up, call prevent default to stop the browser from navigating to it. A router instance has this convenience method navigate, and you can call it with just one argument and it will update the URL for you and nothing else. So if I quickly set window.router equals router, we can see that behavior. So I can call router.navigate and pass it any URL that I like, something. And it's updated the URL for me here without reloading the page. If I call router.navigate images/ an image ID, it's updated the URL for me again. But what it hasn't tried to do is instantiate a new view for that image. And that's because a router is update the URL for that image. If we go back to my code, you can see that I'm actually passing in a second argument to this function called trigger true. And trigger true will tell the router to update the URL and also fire the associated route if there's one bound to it. So if I give it a proper image ID and say trigger true, then that route actually gets triggered and my new image gets displayed. So that's why it's important to pass that option through. That's pretty much all there is to a router. As I mentioned, it's essentially a way to match URLs to functions to set up your pages, and it gives you a place to glue together all of your individual models, views, and collections that you're building.